You know the movie. Cher in a leather jacket, riding across the desert with her disfigured teenage son on the back of her bike. Mask. A Best Actress win buzzed about, a soundtrack fight that made headlines, a tearjerker that Hollywood packaged as an inspirational true story. But the woman behind that character, the real Rusty Dennis, spent years after the cameras stopped rolling saying things about her son, her choices, and that movie that never quite made it into the trailer. Today we're separating the legend from the record, using her own words, and it's not the clean, redemptive story you think you know. Roy Lee Dennis, everyone called him Rocky, was born on December 4, 1961, in California, the son of Florence Rusty Tullis and her second husband, Roy Dennis. For the first couple of years of his life, there was nothing especially alarming going on. He got sick more than most kids. Ear infections, sinus trouble. The kind of thing a pediatrician shrugs about. Then, around age 2, during a round of routine testing, an X-ray technician noticed something wrong with the shape of his skull. That single observation kicked off a battery of tests at UCLA Medical Center, and the diagnosis that came back was one most parents have never even heard of: craniodiaphyseal dysplasia. It's a disease so rare that abnormal calcium deposits build up relentlessly in the skull, thickening the bone, distorting the face, and, this is the part that made it a death sentence rather than just a cosmetic condition, slowly crushing the brain and destroying vision and hearing as it progresses. Doctors did not soften the news for Rusty. They told her flatly that her son would likely go blind, would probably suffer intellectual impairment, and, in all likelihood, would not survive past the age of 7. He lived to 16. That gap, between what medicine predicted and what actually happened, is the entire emotional engine of the movie Mask. But it's also the least complicated part of the real story. The complicated part is what kind of household and what kind of mother produced that outcome. Because Rocky wasn't just a survivor in the medical sense. By the time he reached junior high, he'd become an honor student, despite starting well behind his classmates academically. He was known among peers for his humor and warmth, rather than for the way his face had changed. He tutored younger kids for pocket money and, according to those who knew him, negotiated his own rate for doing it. The picture that consistently emerges, across the people who actually knew him, is of a teenager who built an identity that had almost nothing to do with how the disease had reshaped his appearance. Cher's performance as Rusty won her a Golden Globe and cemented the image most people carry around today, a tough but tender biker mom with a heart of gold. That's not wrong. Exactly. It's just incomplete. The real Florence Rusty Tullis, born Florence Steinberg in Brooklyn on May 29, 1936, was the daughter of a truck driver. She was Jewish, sharp-tongued, and in open rebellion against structure from adolescence onward. At 13, she was expelled from junior high for truancy. By 14, she was smoking marijuana and running with motorcycle gangs. At 15, she dropped out of school entirely and was working as a dancer at Coney Island. At 17, she married her first husband, a truck driver named Tommy Mason, and had her first son, Joshua, before that marriage collapsed and she moved back in with her parents. She later married Roy Dennis, moved to California, and in 1961, Rocky was born. This is the woman who, a few years later, would be told her toddler had a fatal, disfiguring disease. And her response wasn't grief so much as defiance. She built her entire approach to Rocky's illness around a philosophy she held on to for the rest of her life, that if a person can make themselves sick with their own mind, they can make themselves well the same way. Whenever Rocky's headaches flared, and with his condition, they flared constantly, she would send him to his room and tell him, essentially, to will himself better. It's a philosophy that reads as either radical empowerment or troubling minimization, depending on where you're standing. Rusty never publicly apologized for it or reframed it as a mistake. She believed in it to her last breath, and, as we'll get to, she applied it on the very last night of her son's life. Rusty also refused to let institutions define what Rocky was capable of. Doctors said his eyesight was too weak for reading. She ignored them. Schools tried to rout him out of mainstream classrooms. She fought them and won, later suggesting to reporters that the resistance she faced had less to do with Rocky's actual intelligence and more to do with other parents' discomfort at having him in the room. And around Rocky, always, was Rusty's real family. Not a Hollywood biker aesthetic, but an actual outlaw motorcycle circle, the kind built on loyalty rather than polish. The film's gruff, protective Gar, played by Sam Elliott, was based on Rusty's real-life partner, a man named Bernie. That whole rough-edged world of bikers wasn't set dressing for the film. It was the actual support system that surrounded a dying teenager and made sure he never once felt like a tragedy in progress. It's worth pausing on how unusual that upbringing really was for the era. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, institutional attitudes toward visibly disabled children leaned heavily toward segregation, separate classrooms, lowered expectations, and a general assumption that a child who looked different should be sheltered rather than mainstreamed. Rusty pushed directly against all of that, years before disability rights advocacy became a mainstream cultural conversation in the United States. She wasn't working from a textbook or a support group. She was working from instinct, stubbornness, and a household that had already taught her not to trust institutions much in the first place. By 1985, Mask was in theaters everywhere. Directed by Peter Bogdanovich, starring Cher as Rusty and Eric Stoltz, under hours of prosthetic makeup as Rocky, the film pulled in tens of millions at the box office. Rusty had sold the rights to her family's story for $15,000. Sit with that gap for a second. A film that grossed north of $40 million, built from the outline of a family's real suffering, and the mother at the center of it got a fraction of a single % of that. According to multiple accounts, most of that $15,000 didn't even go toward comfort or recognition. It went straight to medical bills for her older son, Joshua, who by the mid-1980s was gravely ill. She wasn't cashing in on Rocky's memory. She was trying to keep her surviving son alive. When reporters came looking for a grateful, tearful mother basking in Hollywood's tribute to her dead son, what they got instead was something much sharper. Rusty called the movie a fairy tale. Not a loving tribute. A fairy tale, her word, and she used it more than once, including to People magazine. In a 1986 interview with the Chicago Tribune, she explained what stung about the finished film. She had assumed the movie would be about Rocky's courage, something that might genuinely help other families raising disabled kids. Kids who, in her view, were sometimes less limited than the adults around them. Instead, the film shifted a huge amount of its weight onto her own character, turning her into a glamorous, complicated screen presence in her own right. On Cher specifically, though, Rusty was generous rather than bitter, telling the Tribune that the performance nailed her, and adding, only half joking, that she'd always considered herself the normal one and the rest of the world the strange one. She also pointed out, bluntly, what the film left out or compressed. A decade plus of real events got folded into something that plays out on screen like roughly a single year. And her older son, Joshua, the boy who was fighting for his life against AIDS-related illness at the very moment Mask hit theaters, doesn't appear in the film at all. He was simply written out. Then there was the fight over the music, which became its own small Hollywood scandal. Rocky had been a devoted Bruce Springsteen fan, and Bogdanovich built the film's original soundtrack around Springsteen's music specifically because of that. But Universal Pictures couldn't finalize licensing with Springsteen's label, and swapped in Bob Seger songs instead, reportedly without fully looping Bogdanovich in on the change. Rusty was unimpressed, telling a San Francisco talk show audience in 1985 that she didn't think Rocky had even known who Bob Seger was. Bogdanovich was furious enough to sue Universal, and it would take almost 2 decades, until a 2004 director's cut, for the Springsteen tracks to actually make it into the film. None of that, the tiny payout, the fairy tale label, the erased brother, the swapped soundtrack, fits neatly into the redemptive Hollywood mom narrative the movie sells. And it's still not the heaviest part of what Rusty said. By the fall of 1978, Rocky's disease had finally caught up with the progress it had been making his whole life. He was 16, in a wheelchair in his final weeks, and his headaches, always severe, had become unbearable. On the night of October 3rd, Rusty and their circle of biker friends threw a small gathering to lift his spirits. Around midnight he woke with a headache. Rusty comforted him and did what she had done his entire life. She sent him to his room and told him to make himself well. He never woke up. Here's where the film and reality genuinely diverge, and where Rusty was direct about the difference. Mask shows her discovering her son's body, a devastating, cinematic beat. In real life, Rusty wasn't home when Rocky died. She was at her lawyer's office, dealing with a drug possession charge she maintained was a mistake. Her partner Bernie was the one who called with the news. She had, by her own account, already warned the hospital that the end was likely near, and had made her son a promise. If it ever came down to machines, she would pull the plug herself, because he'd told her plainly that he didn't want to die hooked up to equipment. He wanted to die at home. He did. Rusty never publicly framed the make yourself well philosophy as something she regretted, even applied on that final night. She never described it as a failure, and it would be dishonest to put words like guilt or regret in her mouth that she never said herself. What the record actually shows is simpler and, in its own way, harder to sit with. She believed in that philosophy completely, until the end of her own life, and she credited it with giving Rocky something she considered more valuable than a few extra months, the refusal to ever see himself as a dying person. To really understand why Rusty sold her family's story at all, you have to understand Joshua. Joshua Mason was Rusty's first son, born when she was 17 and married to her first husband. By the mid-1980s, around the same time Mask was hitting theaters, Joshua, a writer living in San Francisco who was openly gay, was diagnosed with Kaposi's sarcoma, the cancer that became one of the visible faces of the AIDS crisis in that era. Rusty, by most accounts, was supportive of her son, even as she quietly hoped for grandchildren and reportedly floated the idea of a sperm bank. Joshua died in 1987. He was 32. Rusty had now buried both of her sons. The film rights money from Mask, that modest $15,000, had gone largely toward Joshua's medical bills. In other words, Rusty didn't sell Rocky's story to cash in on tragedy for personal gain. She sold it, in significant part, to try to save her other child. When that attempt failed too, she was left as a mother who had now lost both of her boys to circumstances almost entirely outside her control, using the only leverage she had, her family's most painful chapter, to try to buy her surviving son more time. That's the piece the movie leaves completely out of frame. And it recontextualizes almost everything else she said publicly about the film. The fairy tale comment, the frustration about the erased brother, the fight over the soundtrack. All of it sits differently once you know that the money from Mask was, in part, a Hail Mary for Joshua's life. After Rocky's death, Rusty didn't retreat from the world. She relocated to San Francisco, took up Buddhism, and began working as a counselor helping people struggling with addiction, a striking turn for a woman who, by her own account, had partied all the time and considered drugs simply part of that lifestyle rather than something she was hiding from. Around the time Mask was released, she had plans to work with the Shanti Project, an organization supporting terminally ill patients, including many facing AIDS, the same disease that would take her older son. She kept riding motorcycles for the rest of her life. On October 14, 2006, while riding her three-wheeled motorcycle through an intersection, the right tire came off. She lost control, struck a curb, and was thrown into a telephone pole. She broke both legs and punctured a lung, and, true to form, survived the initial impact. What she couldn't survive was the infection that followed. Florence Rusty Tullis died on November 11, 2006, at Beverly Hospital in Montebello, California. She was 70. Strikingly, almost no one around her knew she'd even been hurt until a small item ran in a local paper describing an unidentified 70-year-old woman injured in a motorcycle accident. Friends and family pieced together that it was her and rushed to her side, weeks after the crash itself. A 1986 Chicago Tribune profile once described her, without a hint of irony, as a Jewish mother from Brooklyn, a former drug user, an ex-dancer, and a product distributor, living in an immaculately kept biker crash pad in San Francisco's Mission District alongside a nephew and 3 bikers with nicknames instead of last names. It's one of the more accurate character sketches ever printed about her, precisely because it doesn't try to smooth any of it out. Strip away the Cher wardrobe and the swelling soundtrack, and here's what the actual record shows. Rocky Dennis lived nearly a decade longer than doctors predicted, became an honor student, and by all accounts had a gift for making people laugh instead of pity him. His mother was a school dropout, a former dancer, a woman who used drugs recreationally and never pretended otherwise, and who built her entire parenting style around the unshakable belief that her son was not a victim of his condition. She sold the rights to her son's story for a fraction of what it eventually made, largely to try to save her other child, who died anyway a few years later. She called the film that made her famous a fairy tale to her face, publicly, on the record, while still praising the actress who played her. She never wavered from the make-yourself-well philosophy that had defined Rocky's entire childhood, even on the night it mattered most. Screenwriter Anna Hamilton Phelan, who wrote Mask, put it about as well as anyone has. Rusty was never going to win a PDA Mother of the Year award, but she was exactly the mother Rocky needed. Whether you hear that as praise, as an indictment, or as both at once is entirely up to you, because Rusty Dennis never once tried to smooth herself into a tidier story, not even when she had every incentive to. If you were expecting a clean redemption arc, she was never going to give you one. She gave you something more difficult instead, the truth, exactly as messy as it actually was. There's also something worth noting about how rare this kind of on-record candor actually is. Most families whose private grief gets turned into a studio film either go quiet afterward or lean into the gratitude narrative the press expects from them, because that's the version that keeps the phone calls friendly and the doors open for future opportunities. Rusty did neither. She kept giving interviews for years after Mask came out, and she kept saying the same unpolished things every time, that the movie shifted the spotlight onto her in ways she hadn't asked for, that her older son had been erased from a story that was partly about saving his life, that she stood by a parenting philosophy plenty of people would call reckless. There was no publicist softening those answers. That consistency, more than any single quote, is probably the strongest evidence that what she said was genuinely how she saw things. Not a performance for the cameras, but the same blunt worldview she'd apparently held since she was a teenager getting kicked out of school in Brooklyn. If any of this surprised you, you're not alone. Most people only know the movie version. Let us know in the comments what stood out to you most, and stick around, because there are a lot more stories behind Hollywood's favorite true stories that deserve a second look.